Now let's put it all together as Mao, the grand strategist, of linking all elements of national power into a coherent strategy. These are Mao's instruments of national power. The peasantry, propaganda, land reform, base areas, institution building, warfare, and diplomacy. The U.S. military, when they're thinking about elements of national power, love this little framework, DIME, because D is for diplomacy, I is intelligence, M for military, E for economics, as being critical elements of national power. Look, it's better than only looking at the military elements. At least you got 3 more things. But if you look at what Mao, this is not a cookie cutter event. This is a different society, different national elements of national power are available. You've got to get to the other side of the tennis court net to see what the other team is doing. All right, Mao is famous for all of these reasons, but also for his sinification of Marxism, where he makes all the things that I've told you about. It makes his version of Marxism much more applicable to these countries, the newly independent countries after World War II, of how they put things together. And he positions himself to replace Stalin, who dies in 1953, as the leader of communism. So Mao was prescient on numerous levels. He was certainly prescient about the centrality of the peasantry. He was way ahead of his times on the importance of women. He was calculating and cunning on how he was going to use minorities and POWs. He had proven his coup d'oeil and determination with his military strategy. He also anticipated when the Japanese war in China would stalemate. And he also anticipated more or less when the United States was going to get into the war in Asia. And he's the great signifier of Marxism. All right, Mao produced all kinds of concepts and paradigms that are useful for insurgents who are trying to take over the host from within. And I've listed a variety of them here, and I'm going to go through them in turn. And these are the things that the counterinsurgent then has to counter. All right, rural mobilization. This is obviously a big deal in Mao. And if you compare, I'm going to be doing a lot of comparisons with the Vietnam War and the Korean War, because they're communists and all these things. And you can see Mao's rural mobilization was very successful in China. The North Vietnamese rural mobilization was also really good. South Korea, not so much. Why? The leader, of North Korea trying to mobilize the peasantry in the South, that wasn't so successful. And why? Syngman Rhee, the leader of South Korea, immediately did land reform. And this glues loyalty of soldiers to the leadership doing this. And maybe that is not the only factor, but an important factor for why the Korean War turns out differently. Base areas. Mao says those are really important. The North Vietnamese used them to great effect. They had all kinds of areas in the South and then on the borders of South Vietnam. North Korea, not so much. It couldn't form base areas in the South. Why? It's a peninsula, which the U.S. Navy cut off. It's also cold. So where are you going to flee if you want to do a base area? I think it's up a mountain in South Korea, and that will get cold in the winter, and you'll probably freeze to death. I believe Al-Qaeda means the base. I believe that's the correct translation. So if you're thinking about ISIS or whatever's left of it, you can go back to Mao's ideas about base areas, that you need a particular kind of geography that's good for the defensive. You got to have a big party organization, a lot of local support. You got to have military forces there. Does Al-Qaeda, well, it'd be ISIS or something. Do they have all four of these things, or can you remove any one of them? All right, another idea from Mao is luring the enemy in deep. And Mao had done that very successfully in the first 3 encirclement campaigns, and then he was removed from command, so he wasn't doing that anymore. And again, in the final phases of the Chinese Civil War, the 45 to 49 event, Mao lures the nationalists deep into Manchuria. And the nationalists are a South China phenomenon, right? I showed you the map. Chiang Kai-shek starts in the south and he goes way up north. So he's weakest in the north, but Mao lures him way up there in Manchuria, and then he springs a trap and destroys Chiang Kai-shek's armies up there. And then the entire Civil War wraps up within a year of that. So Mao also lured good old General MacArthur, who fancied himself a great Asianist in the Korean War. MacArthur goes all the way up to the Yalu River, right on the Chinese border in the Korean War, and the Mao springs a trap. And MacArthur didn't realize that, 350,000 Chinese troops had been infiltrated around him. Oops, missed that. It did not work out well. But for the U.S. Navy now, needs to think about, what about being lured into the South and East China Seas, and then the Chinese pulling the trap? There are places you don't need to go. The Chinese may have to go there, but maybe you don't have to. All right, another one is terminal point of retreat. I've talked about Yan'an being a really good one, and that worked. And then when the Manchurian campaign initially wasn't going well for Mao, he retreated up to Siping, which is a little bit north, and that worked well enough. But when Chiang Kai-shek tried to pick these Manchurian cities as a place to retreat in Manchuria, bad news. There's only one railway system that gets you south out of Manchuria. You suppose the communists don't know about it. And they encircled the nationalists in these cities and destroyed them there. So when you're thinking about insurgents and things, think about, well, if you knock them out of one area, where might they go next? All right, another concept from Mao is disintegrating enemy forces, which is what happens to the nationalists. Think about it. Chiang Kai-shek had been fighting since the 1920s and forever and ever and ever, and he fought the Japanese. They're brutal. The United States had trouble fighting the Japanese, and Chiang Kai-shek fought them alone for a long time before we joined the war. And yet, he loses a battle in 1948 in Manchuria, and that's it. The rest of the country wraps up. So what was going on there? Or the South Vietnamese, they've been fighting forever. And then the whole place just wraps up. And the same thing with Japan in World War II, that they've been fighting all over the place forever, fighting us brutally. And then in 1945, we don't even have to invade the home islands. Think how unusual that is. The Germans fought every street on the way to Berlin. The Japanese quit. And this is about disintegrating the enemy and why it happens. But what you can say in all those three cases is the warfare had been going on for an incredibly long time, and it was ruinous, and the places in question were ruined. So don't expect that to happen too fast. And of course, Mao's big contribution are his 3 stages of People's War. And Mao presents them as sequential. You go from 1 to 2 to 3, and ta-da, you win. And they're cumulative, right? You do certain things, and then you get to phase 2, and you've had this cumulative effect of destroying enemy forces, and you get even more accumulating casualties on the other side, and finally you win. A student of mine said that's actually not a great way to look at it, or an even better way to use it is like a metric of how an insurgency goes up and down, so that ISIS may be on the cusp of going into stage 3. I don't know that they're really, well, possibly with all the equipment they got initially, or whether then they get knocked back to stage 1, where you wonder whether they still exist anymore, and come back and forth. Anyway, that was that person's take. I thought I'd pass it along to you. All right, I have one last thing to talk about Mao. Is it when you read these 7,000 pages, and I don't recommend it, one is struck by all these dualities. And I think it goes back to yin and yang analysis, which is very prominent in traditional Chinese thinking. So if you look at Mao discussing triangle building, it's in terms of the presence or absence of factors, presence, absence being opposites. So you're going from the absence of political power to the seizure of political power, from the absence of the Red Army to the creation of the Red Army. And it goes on, that studying the differences and connections between dualities is a task of studying strategy, and it's really everything. So to defend in order to attack, to retreat in order to advance, it goes on, and it's all about correctly orienting yourself with between these opposites. So oppose protracted campaigns in the strategy of a short war. Uphold the strategy of a protracted war in a short campaign. And I'm starting to lose it. And you've got to put everything in the context of each other: losses, replacements, fighting, resting, concentration, and dispersion. And I'm thinking, I don't get this. Mao's bipolar disorder. So I went to this gentleman, Brigadier General Samuel B. Griffith. He is the only translator into English of Sun Tzu, who has a distinguished military career. And also he went on to get a DPhil, that's like a PhD, from Oxford in military history. And if you look at his career, he's in China during the Japanese escalation of the Sino-Japanese War. He's back in China, does another tour at the end of the Chinese Civil War. He gets top marks in the military's Chinese language exam. And oh, look at these details. Navy Cross, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Cross. He's a distinguished man. And for retirement, he decides he's going to go get the Oxford degree, and he writes the translation of Sun Tzu. He is the only translator of Sun Tzu who translates 此地 as death ground. Other people, it's like, oh, I don't know, I can't remember the words, like, I don't know, contested ground, something else. But I'm guessing that when he chose those words, death ground, it's because when he was thinking about it, it might well have conjured up his memories of what exactly it was like to be on Guadalcanal or New Georgia. So he has provided insights. Oh, also the other thing to mention about him is he's really modest. I had to dig around to find these biographical details. They're not on the cover of his book, which is where they should be. And his service to his country continues to this day because it's his translation that continues to educate officers now, what is it, over 40 years after his death. But here's his take. In every apparent disadvantage, some advantage is to be found. The yin is not wholly yin, and the yang is not wholly yang. It is only the wise general, said the Sun Tzu, who is able to recognize this fact and turn it to good account. And of course, Mao could, and he did. But in peacetime, choices are not binary, they're graduated. And evolution is much more conducive to economic development than revolution.
Before we move on to the